Captain Elena Vasquez stared at the massive crystal ship floating in space before them. It looked like someone had carved a mountain of pure diamond and set it among the stars. Light danced across its surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The thing was easily 10 times larger than her own ship, the Defiant Dawn. "Captain, they're responding to our hail," said Lieutenant Torres from the communication station. His voice carried a nervous edge that Elena didn't blame him for. This was humanity's first contact with an alien civilization, and everything about this encounter felt wrong. The main screen flickered to life, showing a figure that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. The being appeared to be made of living light wrapped around a core of shifting energy. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, like thunder rolling across an endless sky. "Mortals," the being said, its tone carrying the weight of ages, "you dare approach the sacred vessels of the Etherni without proper reverence? I am Hegemon Zixthara, servant of the Celestial Dominion, blessed with eternal existence beyond your primitive understanding." Elena straightened in her captain's chair. She had trained for this moment her entire career, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. "I am Captain Elena Vasquez of the human exploration vessel Defiant Dawn. We come in peace, seeking dialogue between our peoples." The being that called itself Zixthara made a sound that might have been laughter, if laughter could freeze blood. "Peace, dialogue? You speak as if you are equals, little mortal. Your species crawls through space in metal boxes, clinging to brief lives that flicker and die like candle flames. We have existed since before your son was born." Around them, more crystal ships appeared from nowhere, materializing out of empty space like thoughts becoming real. Each one pulsed with the same terrible beauty as the first. Elena counted 12, then 20, then stopped counting as more kept appearing. "We are the Etherni," Zixthara continued, and now the being's form began to shift and change, growing larger and more magnificent. "We transcended the weakness of flesh eons ago. Death holds no dominion over us. We are as close to gods as matter can become." Elena felt her crew's fear through the ship's atmosphere. She could see it in their faces, hear it in their breathing. But she also saw something else, the stubborn human refusal to bow down even in the face of the impossible. "We respect your achievements," Elena said carefully. "But humanity doesn't recognize gods. We believe in earning our place in the universe through our own efforts." The silence that followed her words felt dangerous. When Zixthara spoke again, the temperature on the bridge seemed to drop several degrees. "You refuse to acknowledge our divinity." The being's voice carried disbelief and growing anger. "Perhaps a demonstration is required." The space around the Defiant Dawn suddenly erupted in impossible colors. Elena watched in awe and terror as one of the Etherni ships began to change shape, its crystal structure flowing like water. Within moments, it had transformed from a geometric marvel into something that resembled a massive flowering plant, made of pure energy. "Matter bends to our will," Zixthara explained, sounding almost bored. "We reshape reality as easily as you might rearrange furniture. Watch now as we demonstrate the ultimate gift of our godhood." Elena saw a flash of light leap from the transformed ship to another Etherni vessel. When the light faded, she realized that Zixthara now stood on that second ship, visible through its transparent hull. The being had somehow moved its consciousness across space instantly. "Death cannot touch us," Zixthara said. And now Elena could see multiple copies of the being appearing on different ships throughout the fleet. "When one form fails, we simply choose another. We are truly eternal." Elena's tactical officer, Commander Sarah Chen, leaned close to whisper in her ear. "Captain, our sensors are picking up quantum entanglement networks connecting all their ships. That's how they're transferring consciousness." Elena nodded slightly, filing the information away. It was good to know that even gods had to follow some kind of rules, even if those rules were far beyond current human understanding. "Impressive," Elena said aloud, "but immortality without purpose seems empty to us. What do you do with all that time?" "We rule," Zixthara replied simply. "Lesser species across 1,000 worlds worship us as we deserve. They bring us tribute, build temples in our honor, and live according to our divine will. It is the natural order of things." Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And if a species refuses? Then they learn the price of defying gods." Zixthara's form blazed brighter, and Elena could feel the threat in those words like a physical weight. "We offer you this choice once, mortals. Kneel before the celestial dominion, accept your place as our servants, worship us as your betters, and we will allow your species to continue existing under our protection. Elena looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew. She saw fear there, yes, but also determination. These were humans who had crossed the void between stars, who had dared to reach out to the unknown. They hadn't come this far to bow down to anyone, no matter how powerful. "I'm sorry," Elena said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "But that's not who we are. Humanity doesn't kneel to gods, real or imagined. We make our own way in the universe." The reaction was immediate and terrible. The crystal ships around them began to pulse with angry light, and Elena could feel power building in the alien vessels like gathering storm clouds. "Then you have chosen death," Zixthera said, and the being's voice now carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Your species is clearly too primitive to understand the honor we offered. We will cleanse this system of your presence and find more worthy mortals to serve us." Elena opened a channel to her crew and to the other human ships that had followed them into this first contact situation. "All ships, this is Captain Vasquez. Diplomatic contact has failed. The aliens consider themselves gods and demand our submission. As of now, we are at war with an immortal enemy." She paused, looking at the impossible ships surrounding them, each one capable of bending reality to its will. Then she smiled grimly. "But here's something these so-called gods might have forgotten," she continued. "Humans have been fighting impossible odds since we first picked up sticks and stones. We've never met a god we couldn't find a way to kill. All ships, prepare for combat. Let's show these immortals what mortality looks like when it refuses to quit." The Etherni ships began to move, their crystal hulls singing with power that could reshape worlds. But Elena Vasquez and her crew stood ready to face them, carrying with them something the immortal Etherni had forgotten. In their endless existence, the desperate courage of those who knew their time was limited and were determined to make every moment count. The war between mortality and immortality was about to begin. The first shots of the war lit up the Sigma Centauri system like deadly fireworks. Helena watched from the bridge of the Defiant Dawn as beams of pure energy lanced out from the Etherni crystal ships. Where those beams touched space itself, reality seemed to bend and twist in ways that made her eyes water. "Evasive maneuvers," she shouted as one of those impossible weapons swept toward them. The ship lurched sideways just as space where they had been suddenly folded in on itself, creating a hole in existence that swallowed light and matter alike. "Captain, the Wellington just took a direct hit," reported Lieutenant Torres, his voice tight with shock. Elena turned to see the human destroyer simply cease to exist. Not destroyed in an explosion, just gone as if it had never been there at all. The Etherni hadn't just destroyed the ship, they had erased it from reality. "All ships, scatter formation," Elena ordered. "Don't give them easy targets." But even as she gave the command, she knew they were facing something beyond their understanding. The Etherni war temples moved through space like living things, their crystal hulls reshaping themselves to deflect human weapons. Missiles that should have struck their targets instead curved away as if space itself was protecting the alien ships. "Commander Sarah." Chen gripped her tactical station as another reality-bending blast swept past them. "Captain, our weapons aren't even scratching them. Their hulls are made of some kind of programmable matter. It's like trying to fight geometry itself." Elena watched 3 more human ships disappear under the alien assault. Each one represented hundreds of lives, people who had trusted her to lead them into this first contact situation. The weight of that responsibility threatened to crush her, but she pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for grief later if any of them survived. "Chen, what about boarding actions?" Elena asked suddenly. "If we can't fight their ships, maybe we can fight them directly." Sarah's eyes widened as she understood. "It's crazy enough that it might work. If we can get inside their reality manipulation field, maybe their own defenses will protect us from their weapons." "Do it," Elena said without hesitation. "Prep boarding teams for immediate launch." On the largest Etherni ship, Hegemon Zixthara watched the human fleet with growing confusion. The mortals should have been destroyed within minutes of the battle beginning. Their primitive weapons and crude metal ships were no match for Etherni technology that could reshape the very fabric of space. Yet somehow, the humans kept fighting. More disturbing, they seemed to be adapting to Etherni tactics with impossible speed. When reality warping beams swept toward them, human ships would suddenly change course in ways that violated their own physics. Some captains were deliberately ramming their vessels into Etherni hulls. accepting certain death to cause even minimal damage. "This is impossible," muttered sub-hegemon Kylthos, another energy being whose consciousness flickered with uncertainty. "They should be fleeing in terror. No mortal species has ever stood against us for more than moments." Sixathera felt something stirring in the depths of memory, a feeling so old and forgotten that it took several processing cycles to identify it. Unease. When had an immortal last felt truly uncertain about the outcome of a battle? "They fight like they have nothing to lose," Sixathera observed, watching a human frigate deliberately position itself between an Etherni blast and a damaged cruiser. The frigate vanished instantly, but the cruiser survived to continue fighting. "This makes no tactical sense. The captain of that vessel accepted certain death for minimal strategic gain. Perhaps their primitive minds cannot properly calculate risk," suggested Kylthos. But Sixathera wasn't convinced. The humans were clearly intelligent enough to build star-traveling vessels and quantum communication systems. Their tactics weren't born from ignorance. They came from something else entirely. The answer became clear when the first human boarding pod slammed into the hull of an Etherni dreadnought. Instead of being repelled by the ship's defensive fields, the pod somehow synced with the crystal structure and burned through it like acid through flesh. Commander Sarah Chen led the boarding party into the alien ship, her heart pounding as she stepped into a corridor made of living light. The walls pulsed around them like the inside of some vast organism, and gravity seemed to change direction with each step. "Stay together," she whispered into her comm unit. "These things can manipulate reality, but they still need physical forms to interact with our universe." Her team moved deeper into the ship, following readings that suggested the location of the main consciousness matrix. What they found there defied description: a chamber filled with floating crystals, each one containing a swirling galaxy of thoughts and memories. Sarah raised her weapon toward the largest crystal but hesitated. This wasn't just a computer or a control system. This was a living being, ancient beyond human comprehension. Destroying it would be murder. Then she thought of the Wellington and the hundreds of other humans who had died in the past hour. These beings claimed to be gods and demanded worship from every species they encountered. They saw humans as nothing more than insects to be crushed or enslaved. "For humanity," Sarah whispered, and pulled the trigger. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystal shattered under conventional human bullets. Apparently, for all their reality-bending power, the Etherni hadn't bothered to make their consciousness matrices bulletproof. Why would gods need to fear such primitive weapons? The being inside the crystal didn't just die. It experienced something it hadn't felt in millions of years. True fear. In its final moments, the Etherni consciousness felt the absolute terror of knowing that it was about to cease existing forever. That fear rippled out through the quantum entanglement network that connected all Etherni minds. For the first time in eons, every member of the species remembered what it felt like to be mortal. Sixathera reeled as the death scream of a fellow immortal tore through the collective consciousness. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The mortals had somehow found a way to kill gods. "Retreat," Sixathera commanded, but the order came too late. More human boarding parties were already burning through Etherni hulls throughout the fleet. Wherever humans went, immortals began to die. Helena watched from her command chair as the tide of battle began to shift. The Etherni ships were pulling back, their perfect formations dissolving into chaos. For beings who had never needed to fear death, the sudden possibility of permanent destruction was paralyzing. "Captain, we're receiving a transmission from the enemy flagship," reported Torres. "Put it through," Elena said. Sixathera's image appeared on the screen, but the being looked different now. The confident glow of divinity had been replaced by something almost like panic. "You dare kill the immortal?" Sixathera demanded, but the words lacked their earlier authority. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elena leaned forward in her chair. "We've reminded you that gods can bleed," she said simply. "And if gods can bleed, that means they can die." "This is not over, mortal," Sixathera snarled, but even as the being spoke, more Etherni ships were withdrawing from the battle. "We will return with forces beyond your comprehension." "We'll be ready," Elena replied. The Etherni fleet vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the wreckage of human ships and the knowledge that immortality was not as absolute as gods like to believe. In the quiet that followed, Elena allowed herself a moment to mourn the dead, before turning her attention to the future. Humanity had just made enemies of beings who considered themselves divine. The war was far from over, but they had proven something important. Even gods could be taught to fear. Admiral Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the Prometheus Unbound and watched the massive Etherni fleet assembling in the distance. 3 months had passed since the first encounter, and the enemy had returned with a force that darkened the stars themselves. Thousands of crystal ships hung in space like a constellation of deadly jewels, each one pulsing with reality-bending power. "Admiral, final count shows over 3,000 enemy vessels," reported his tactical officer. "Our entire fleet numbers less than 200 ships." Marcus nodded grimly. The odds were worse than anything humanity had ever faced, but that had never stopped them before. Behind him, the experimental weapon that represented their only hope hummed with barely contained energy. "Status on the quantum cascade disruptor?" he asked. Chief Engineer Rodriguez looked up from her console, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool bridge temperature. "All systems green, Admiral. But I have to remind you, we've never tested this thing on a live target. The theoretical models suggest it will work, but theory and reality don't always match." Marcus allowed himself a thin smile. "Engineer, humanity's entire history is based on the gap between theory and reality. We've been improvising our way through impossible situations since we first looked up at the stars. The quantum cascade disruptor had been humanity's answer to the Etherni consciousness transfer technology. Human scientists had realized that the aliens' immortality depended on quantum entanglement networks that spanned vast distances. Break those networks and the gods would become as mortal as anyone else. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the enemy fleet," announced the communications officer. The main screen flickered to life, showing Hegemon Zixathera in all its terrible glory. But Marcus noticed something different about the being. Where before it had radiated absolute confidence, now there was something almost like caution in its movements. "Admiral Webb," Zixathera said, and the fact that it bothered to use his name spoke volumes. "Your species has proven more persistent than anticipated. We offer you one final opportunity to accept the natural order. Surrender now, and we will grant your people the mercy of quick extinction rather than prolonged suffering." Marcus straightened his uniform jacket with deliberate calm. "Counteroffer," he said. "You pack up your ships and leave human space forever. We'll even throw in a promise not to hunt you down across the galaxy. How's that for mercy?" The being's form flared with anger, but Marcus caught something else in that reaction: uncertainty. The Etherni were no longer dealing with primitive mortals who would cower at their approach. They were facing an enemy that had already proven capable of killing gods. "Your arrogance will be your destruction," Zixathera declared. "We have assembled the largest fleet in Etherni history. Every world in our domain has contributed ships to ensure your complete annihilation. You cannot stand against the combined might of 1,000 civilizations. Watch us," Marcus replied simply, and cut the transmission. The battle began moments later. Reality itself seemed to scream as Etherni weapons lashed out across space. Stars disappeared behind fields of twisted space-time, and human ships vanished into holes in existence that snapped shut like hungry mouths. But this time, humanity was ready. They had learned from the first encounter, adapting their tactics to fight an enemy that could reshape the battlefield at will. Human ships moved in tight formations, using their own vessels as shields while closing to boarding range. Every captain knew their mission: get close enough to the enemy ships to deliver boarding parties, and keep the Etherni busy while the Prometheus Unbound moved into position. Captain Elena Vasquez, now commanding the rebuilt Defiant Dawn II, led a charge directly at the heart of the Etherni formation. Around her, human ships died by the dozens, but each sacrifice brought them closer to their goal. "All ships, this is Admiral Webb," Marcus announced over the fleet communications. "Execute Plan Prometheus. Give us the opening we need." Elena smiled grimly as she heard the order. Plan Prometheus was essentially organized suicide. Every human ship would throw itself at the enemy with the sole purpose of creating chaos and confusion. But if it worked, it would give the Prometheus Unbound the few minutes it needed to deploy the quantum cascade disruptor. "You heard the Admiral," Elena told her crew. "We're not going home today, but we're going to make sure our kids have a home to go to." All power to engines. Ramming speed. The Defiant Dawn II accelerated toward a massive Etherni dreadnought, its hull already glowing from enemy fire. Elena thought of her daughter back on Earth. safe in a school where children still learned that humans were alone in the universe. If this plan worked, her daughter would grow up in a galaxy where humanity had earned its place among the stars. Aboard the Prometheus Unbound, Marcus watched the tactical display as his fleet died around him. Each red dot that winked out represented friends and colleagues, people who had trusted him to lead them into this impossible battle. But their sacrifice was creating the distraction he needed. "Admiral, we're in position," reported the weapons officer. "Quantum Cascade Disruptor is locked onto the center of the enemy formation." Marcus took a deep breath. Everything humanity had learned about Etherni technology suggested this would work. But if they were wrong, if the weapon failed, then the human race would face extinction within the hour. "Fire," he ordered. The Quantum Cascade Disruptor unleashed its payload, not a beam or a projectile, but a wave of quantum interference that swept out from the Prometheus Unbound at the speed of light. To the naked eye, nothing seemed to happen, but across the Etherni fleet, the impossible began to occur. Zixathara felt the moment when the network died. 1 second, the being existed across multiple ships simultaneously, consciousness flowing freely through quantum pathways that had operated for millions of years. The next second, those pathways simply ceased to exist. For the first time since achieving immortality, Zixathara was trapped in a single body. The sensation was so alien, so terrifying, that the being's first reaction was to simply freeze in absolute panic. Across the Etherni fleet, the same thing was happening. Immortal beings who had forgotten what it meant to be confined to one form suddenly found themselves experiencing the ultimate horror, the possibility of true death. "Impossible," Zixathara whispered, staring at displays that showed the quantum entanglement network collapsing throughout the fleet. "They've severed our connection to eternity. We're mortal." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Etherni ships began to pull back from the human fleet, their captains no longer willing to risk destruction, when destruction might actually mean something. For beings who had spent eons treating war as an abstract exercise, the sudden possibility of permanent death changed everything. Marcus watched in amazement as the enemy formation dissolved into chaos. Etherni ships that moments before had been pressing their attack were now fleeing in all directions. The gods had remembered what it meant to be afraid. "Admiral, we're receiving multiple surrender requests from enemy vessels," reported the communications officer, his voice filled with disbelief. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained grim. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Etherni still had vast fleets scattered across the galaxy, and now humanity had given them the ultimate motivation for revenge, the fear of death. "Accept the surrenders," Marcus ordered, "but stay alert. We've just taught immortal beings that they can die. That makes them either our greatest allies or our most dangerous enemies." On the bridge of his crippled flagship, Zixathara stared at the human fleet with something approaching respect. The mortals had done the impossible. They had found a way to make gods mortal again. For the first time in millions of years, Zixathara wondered what it would be like to truly die. And in that wondering, the being began to understand something that humans had always known. That mortality wasn't a weakness to be overcome, but a strength that gave meaning to every moment of existence. The cascade effect spread through Etherni space like a virus of mortality. On world after world, immortal beings who had ruled for millions of years suddenly found themselves trapped in single bodies, facing the terrifying reality that their next death might be their last. Sub-Hegemon Kylthos stood in the great crystal palace of Etherni Prime, watching emergency reports flood in from across their domain. The massive holographic display showed the Empire's quantum network collapsing sector by sector, each failure leaving thousands of immortals cut off from their backup consciousness matrices. "How far has it spread?" asked Elder Vixera, her energy form flickering with what could only be described as panic. For a being who had existed since the birth of galaxies, the concept of permanent endings was almost incomprehensible. "The cascade has affected 60% of our territory," Kylthos reported, his voice heavy with despair. "The quantum interference is self-propagating, spreading through our own network infrastructure. Every attempt to re-establish connections only feeds the disruption." Hegemon Zixathara materialized in the chamber, but the being's appearance shocked the assembled council. Where once Zixithara had been a magnificent fusion of light and energy, now the hegemon appeared smaller, more solid, almost fragile. "Report," Zixithara commanded, but even the being's voice had changed. Gone was the thunderous authority of divinity, replaced by something that sounded almost mortal. "The human's weapon has crippled us," admitted Kylothos. "Worse, our subject species are beginning to rebel. They've realized that their gods can now die permanently. On 17 worlds, local populations have risen against our temples." Zixithara absorbed this information with growing horror. The Etherni Empire hadn't been built on military might alone. It had been founded on the absolute psychological dominance that came from being truly immortal. When lesser species believed their rulers were eternal and untouchable, resistance seemed pointless. But now, "Show me the rebellion reports," Zixithara ordered. The display shifted to show scenes from across the Empire. On the water world of Kylos, the fish-like Kylonians were dismantling Etherni temples with their bare fins, no longer afraid of divine retribution. On the desert planet Zara, the nomadic tribes had united for the first time in centuries, their war chants declaring that the false gods could bleed. But the worst was yet to come. In the Outer Rim territories, something unprecedented was happening. Etherni were dying. Not transferring to new bodies or backing up their consciousness, but experiencing true, final death. And each death sent waves of terror through their kind. "We need to strike back," declared Elder Mixthor, his ancient consciousness blazing with fury. "Assemble what remains of the fleet. If we cannot be immortal, then we'll ensure the humans join us in mortality." "With what?" Zixithara asked bitterly. "Half our ships are crewed by beings who refuse to leave their home systems. The other half are commanded by officers too terrified of permanent death to engage in meaningful combat." It was true. Across the Etherni military, immortal commanders who had once led fearless charges into enemy fire now hesitated at every decision. The psychological shift from immortal to mortal had been too sudden, too complete. Warriors who had fought for eons without concern for personal safety now found themselves paralyzed by the possibility that their next battle might be their last. On the human side, Admiral Webb was dealing with the opposite problem. News of humanity's victory had spread throughout human space, and volunteers were arriving at recruitment centers faster than they could be processed. Earth's children had learned that gods could be killed, and they wanted to be part of the force that finished the job. "Admiral, we're detecting massive fleet movements in Etherni space," reported Captain Sarah Chen, who had been promoted after her successful boarding actions. "Intelligence suggests they're pulling back from their outer territories to defend their core worlds." Marcus studied the tactical displays with satisfaction. The quantum cascade had done more than just disrupt Etherni immortality. It had shattered their entire strategic doctrine. An empire built on the assumption of eternal existence couldn't adapt quickly to the reality of death. "What about the subject species?" Marcus asked. "Rebellions on 43 worlds and counting," Sarah replied with a grin. "Turns out when people realize their oppressors can die, they stop being quite so oppressed." But Marcus knew the victory was incomplete. Somewhere in the depths of Etherni space, scientists and engineers were undoubtedly working to reverse the cascade effect. The window for decisive action was narrow. "Prep the fleet for deep penetration into enemy territory," Marcus ordered. "We need to hit their primary research facilities before they figure out how to restore their immortality." Back on Etherni Prime, Zixithara stood alone in the chamber where the Empire's greatest minds had once gathered to contemplate eternity. Now most of those minds were hiding in bunkers or fleeing to remote systems, too terrified of mortality to risk themselves in research that might lead to their permanent destruction. For the first time in millions of years, Zixithara felt something that had been alien since achieving immortality: loneliness. The being stared at its reflection in the crystal walls and saw not a god, but a frightened creature desperately clinging to existence. "Hegemon?" A voice interrupted the meditation. Zixithara turned to see Dr. Nixvalon, one of the few Etherni scientists still willing to work on the immortality problem. But even this researcher showed signs of the new mortality. The being's energy form was tightly contained, no longer willing to risk the expansive consciousness that had once marked Etherni confidence. "Have you found a solution?" Zixithara asked. "Perhaps," Nixvalon replied hesitantly, "but the research is dangerous. We need to experiment with quantum consciousness transfer while the cascade is still active. There's a significant chance that anyone attempting the procedure will experience permanent dissolution. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In the old days, such a risk would have been meaningless. Etherni researchers had routinely destroyed thousands of backup bodies in pursuit of knowledge, knowing that their consciousness would simply transfer to new forms. But now, with only one life to lose, even the possibility of death was paralyzing. "Find volunteers," Zixthara ordered, then paused. "No, find someone expendable. Use the criminals from the detention matrices." But even as the words left the being's communication array, Zixthara felt a strange sensation, something that might have been guilt. In their immortal days, Etherni had experimented on lesser beings without thought, but they had never condemned their own kind to potential oblivion. The fear of death was changing them in ways they had never anticipated. Meanwhile, reports continued to pour in from across the Empire. The human fleet was advancing through Etherni space, and wherever they went, the quantum cascade spread further. Subject worlds were declaring independence. Etherni commanders were abandoning their posts, and the entire structure of the greatest empire in galactic history was crumbling under the weight of newly discovered mortality. Zixthara looked at the strategic displays showing humanity's inexorable advance and realized something that would have been unthinkable just months before. The Etherni were losing. Not just this battle or this war, but their entire way of existence. For the first time since achieving godhood, Zixthara wondered if the humans might be right. Perhaps immortality wasn't the ultimate achievement. Perhaps mortality, with all its fears and limitations, was what gave life meaning. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. If death was inevitable, then perhaps it was time to learn how to live with dignity rather than trying to cling to a godhood that had already been lost. The war ended, not with a final battle, but with a conversation. Admiral Marcus Webb stood in the crystal chamber aboard the Etherni flagship, surrounded by beings who had once commanded the loyalty of 1,000 worlds. The quantum cascade had done its work completely. The Immortality Network was gone forever, its quantum foundations scattered beyond any hope of repair. Hegemon Zixthara faced him across a table made of living light, but the being's appearance had changed dramatically. The energy form that had once blazed with divine authority was now contained within a physical shell, something resembling a tall, graceful humanoid made of crystalline material. It was beautiful in its own way, but undeniably finite. "So this is what mortality looks like," Zixthara said, examining hands that could now be destroyed forever. "I had forgotten how heavy existence could feel." Marcus nodded respectfully. The past months of warfare had taught him that even former gods deserved dignity when they chose to face reality with courage. "It takes some getting used to, but I think you'll find that mortality has its own rewards." Around the table sat the survivors of the Etherni High Council, their forms now locked into single bodies, their consciousness no longer able to leap between vessels scattered across space. Some looked broken by the transition, their energy forms flickering with barely contained panic. Others, like Zixthara, seemed to be adapting with surprising grace. "Our empire is finished," admitted sub-hegemon Kylthos, his voice carrying millennia of exhaustion. "The subject worlds have all declared independence. Our own people refuse to leave their home systems, too terrified of death to maintain our territorial claims. Perhaps that's for the best," said Dr. Nix Vallon, who had spent the final months of the war studying human philosophy, rather than trying to restore Etherni immortality. "We ruled through fear and claimed it was divine right. Now that we face the same fears as those we oppressed, it becomes clear how unjust our system truly was." Marcus leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "The question now is what comes next. Humanity doesn't want to rule over you. We've seen what happens when species try to play God over others. But we also can't allow the chaos that's spreading through former Etherni space to continue. What do you propose?" Zixthara asked. "A partnership," Marcus replied. "Your people have technology and knowledge that could benefit everyone. Our people have something you've lost: experience in living meaningful lives within the constraints of mortality. Maybe we can learn from each other." The suggestion sparked immediate debate among the Etherni representatives. Some rejected the idea of working with the species that had stripped them of immortality, Others argued that isolation would only lead to further decline and eventual extinction. You ask us to trust the very beings who destroyed our godhood, challenged Elder Vixara, her crystalline form rigid with anger. We ask you to trust the beings who gave you back your humanity, Marcus replied gently. Immortality didn't make you gods. It made you prisoners of your own power. Now you're free to discover what you can truly become. Zixithera was quiet for a long moment, processing concepts that had been alien for millions of years. Finally, the being spoke with something approaching wonder. I watched a sunset yesterday, Zixithera said quietly, not through sensors or remote observation, but with these eyes from this body that will someday cease to function. I had seen billions of sunsets over the eons, but I had never truly watched one before. The knowledge that I might not see another one made it beautiful in a way I had never understood. The admission sent ripples of shock through the Etherni Council. Their leader was not just accepting mortality. Zixithara was finding meaning in it. That's what we've been trying to tell you, said Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been quietly observing the negotiations. Life isn't valuable because it lasts forever. It's valuable because it doesn't. Over the following months, the galaxy began to reshape itself. The Etherni Empire collapsed completely, but from its ruins emerged something unprecedented, a loose confederation of worlds working together by choice rather than compulsion. Former subject species found themselves partnering with their former oppressors, united by the shared experience of mortality. Some Etherni struggled with the transition. Unable to cope with the reality of finite existence, they retreated into isolation or simply stopped functioning altogether. But others, led by Zixithera's example, threw themselves into learning how to live rather than merely exist. Human teachers traveled to Etherni worlds, sharing not technology or weapons but philosophy and art. They taught courses on finding purpose in limited time, on creating beauty that would outlast its creators, on the strange courage that came from knowing that every choice mattered because there might not be another chance to choose. In return, Etherni scientists shared knowledge that advanced human understanding by centuries. They provided insights into space-time manipulation, consciousness transfer, and technologies that humans had never dreamed possible. But more importantly, they offered a new perspective on existence itself. We spent millions of years believing that perfection lay in never-ending, Zixithera explained to a gathering of human and Etherni students. But perfection isn't about duration, it's about intensity. A single moment of genuine connection, of true understanding, of selfless love can be worth more than eternity spent in isolation. The being paused, looking out at faces that would age and die while Zixithera's crystalline form might last for centuries more. But that difference no longer seemed like a barrier. It seemed like an opportunity to learn from each other's unique perspectives on existence. Your species taught us that gods don't create meaning through power over others, Zixithera continued. Gods create meaning by choosing to care about something beyond themselves, even when that caring might lead to loss, even when that loss might be permanent. Elena, now serving as humanity's ambassador to the new confederation, smiled as she listened to the former deity's words. The war that had begun with humanity refusing to kneel before gods had ended with gods learning to kneel before the beauty of mortal existence. As the sun set over the crystal spires of New Etherni, the first world jointly governed by former immortals and persistent mortals, Zixithera stood at a window and watched the light fade. The being's body would eventually fail, consciousness would someday end, and all the accumulated knowledge of millions of years would pass into memory. But for the first time since achieving immortality, Zixithera was not afraid of that ending. Instead, the being felt something that had been lost for eons, gratitude for the time that remained, and wonder at what meaning could be created before that time ran out. In the distance, human children played with young Etherni, their laughter echoing through streets where temples to false gods had been replaced with schools dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the celebration of finite existence. The galaxy had not become perfect, but it had become something better, a place where mortality and meaning walked hand in hand toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The gods had learned to die, and in learning to die they had finally learned to live.